Quentin returns to Austin, where he begins work on a new project. Despite convincing from the Weinstein brothers, he refused to make a Django sequel, but having fallen in love with the main character couldn't get him out of his head. So he decided to write a few stories and publish them in softcover. Some typical Pulp Fiction, so to speak.
Funny.
The first one he started writing was The Rugged Django in White Hell. But the further he got with the story, the more he realized that the character just didn't fit the narrative canvas. So Quentin changed the character and turned the short story into a screenplay.
Got room for one more?
By the end of the year, he had the first draft of a script on his hands entitled The Hateful Eight. It needed some serious work since usually Tarantino's final copy was always the fourth or fifth rewrite. But before doing the final edit, he wanted to make sure he had the support of 6 people with whom he wanted to make the movie. The names of 2 of them remain a mystery, but the others were Michael Madsen, Tim Roth, Bruce Dern, and the producer of Django, Reggie Hudlin. It was one of these men who was responsible for the leak, which led to the screenplay being published online.
If I don't hear a confession from one of you fuckers quick, fast, and in a hurry, I'm gonna pour this whole pot of coffee down that goddamn throat.
This was an unprecedented event for such a small circle of confidants. Quentin was furious. He gave an interview where he announced that he wouldn't be filming the movie. Later, believing that Reggie Hudlin was responsible for the leak, he filed a lawsuit against him. But if the director dumped the film, how did it end up being shot?
How so?
Yep, 6 months later, when Tarantino had cooled down, he decided to host an open reading in Los Angeles with the actors he had planned to hire. The event had 1,200 people in the audience, who on average had paid $200 for a ticket. They were not disappointed. In the end, the audience gave a standing ovation, and the actors began to convince Tarantino to film it after all. Quentin was so touched that right then and there, he declared that his 8th film would be Hateful Eight.
I knew it!
The cast was mostly made up of Tarantino's friends for whom he had written the roles.
You're writing your life story.
You bet I am.
Am I in it?
You just entered.
The choice of Kurt Russell for the role of John Ruth the Hangman was an interesting one. Tarantino mentioned several times that Hateful Eight only referenced 2 films, Reservoir Dogs and The Thing.
There's a storm hitting us in 6 hours. We're gonna find out who's who.
And Kurt Russell was the lead role in the second. The rest of the connections are easy to follow. The heroes don't trust each other while being trapped in a closed space because of a snowstorm. Russell's character is paranoid and disarms the rest of the characters.
Put those torches on the floor and back off.
Like I said, nothing personal, just a precaution.
And of course, Ennio Morricone, who composed the music for both films. By the way, because he was pressed for time, he had to give Tarantino unused music which he had written for The Thing, but which had been gathering dust on the shelf for more than 30 years.
This is a once in a lifetime thing, and I'm just happy to have a front row seat.
Not counting a few small roles in Demian Bashir and Channing Tatum, the main role of casting was to find an actress for the role of Daisy Domergue.
You don't know nothing about this fella here.
Nope.
Don't even know her name.
Nope.
Rumors tied the role to Jennifer Lawrence and Uma Thurman, but Quentin did as he had often done in his career. He chose an actress whose glory days seemed to have passed.
Hey, little apple blossom,
Jennifer Jason Leigh.
A lot of times, this town or this business really only looks at your last 3 projects. Quentin is the exception to that. He looks at your whole body of work. He would talk to me about moments I had in flesh and blood, as though they were yesterday.
Hush, soldier. Don't tell them. I beg of you.
He's that thorough, and that's just how his brain works. When he looks at you, he doesn't see just what you did the last 2 years.
It's symbolic that a few months before casting, Jennifer had attended the reading of the script as an audience member.
That's why this chapter is called Domergue's Got a Secret.
Before filming began, Quentin insisted that the movie be filmed on some incredibly rare equipment. They used cameras and lenses which had been used to film Ben-Hur. The exact lenses. They were restored and tested over 6 months to make sure they were ready to be used in extremely cold temperatures. Hateful Eight became the 11th film in the history of cinematography to be filmed in Ultra Panavision, which has an aspect ratio of 2.76 to 1.
Ultra Panavision. When you absolutely positively got to wow everyone in the room, except no substitutes.
On the 8th of December 2014 at a ranch near Telluride, Colorado, they began filming Hateful Eight.
Considering there's a blizzard going on. Whole lot of fellas walking around, wouldn't you say, Major?
Without leaving Colorado, the film crew shot the exterior of the haberdashery and the panoramic views of the San Miguel Mountains, while the rest of the 3.5 months of filming were done in a pavilion in Los Angeles, outfitted so that the temperature inside was never above 35 degrees.
You okay, O.B.?
I'm fine. I'll be fine. I just need to get warm.
When guitarists hear the story connected to a scene shot in one long take, where Daisy Domergue performs the song Jim Jones at Botany Bay.
For life, Jim Jones, I sentence you across the stormy sea.
Their blood runs cold. Jennifer was playing on a priceless antique 1870 Martin, on loan from the Martin Museum. There were a few copies at the set, but
You're never going to cut a scene until Quentin says cut, and Kurt thought it must be a dummy guitar. I don't think Quentin knew that it was the vintage instrument either. The scene was going exactly the way he wanted it to go, and he wanted to play one scene in the movie in real time without a cut, in one long take.
Music time's over.
Kurt felt terrible. He had no idea. When he found out, his eyes literally welled up.
this explains Daisy's frantic reaction since this moment was captured in the final version of the picture. And though the insurance covered the cost of the damage, representatives of the Martin Museum said they would never again allow one of their guitars to be used for a film.
No! Yeah! Shut up!
The last scenes were filmed on the 5th of April 2015, after which Quentin spent 6 months working on editing the picture. Simultaneously, the Weinstein Company began preparing for the release of the widest formatted film that had been released in the last 60 years. They searched for, bought, and restored 70mm projectors in 100 cinemas across the country, and invested $10 million in the process. This was a move unheard of in the prime of the IMAX era. The premiere was planned for the 25th of December. 4 days before that, Tarantino got his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and everything seemed to be going great.
He's all about making films that make you happy, because we went to the movies to be happy.
The first showing of The Hateful Eight was supposed to be at the legendary Los Angeles Cinerama Dome. It was one of the few theaters in the whole world equipped for this type of film, and had a deep symbolic meaning for Quentin, who had been going to it since he was a child. But then...
Basically, and I'm not talking about the whole country, but I'm talking about one theater in particular.
You sound nervous about this.
Well, it's a big fucking deal.
All right, go ahead. Go ahead.
We were going to play at the Cinerama Dome on the 25th. We were going to open there and play there exclusively for 2 weeks. And Star Wars was going to play the 2 weeks before us. And I grew up in Los Angeles, so I think of the Cinerama Dome as a real big deal, and imagine seeing it at the Cinerama Dome.
Means something to you.
Exactly.
Right.
Disney, who owns Star Wars, decided, well, you know what? Maybe we want to play throughout the entire holiday season. We're going to go to the Cinerama Dome and say that they can't honor their contract with us to show The Hateful Eight. And the ArcLight people that own the Cinerama Dome said, no, you can't do that. We have a deal. As of yesterday, Disney came to the ArcLight people and said, no.
Wow.
You are going to play Star Wars in the Cinerama Dome for the entire holiday season. And if you don't, if you honor your deal with the Hateful Eight, we will not allow you to have Star Wars, the biggest movie in the world. We will not allow you to show it at any of your ArcLight movie theaters. Oh. They are going out of their way to
Quentin, in all fairness, I must say there's nobody from Disney here to refute that or to say.
No, but as far as
I understand how you feel.
As far as I'm concerned, then let all the entertainment reporters call up Disney as of now and ask for their comments about their extortionist practices.
Listen, Bob, I'm talking to Bob Iger. I don't give a about this theater. Quentin's a weirdo. Sorry, Quentin. The kid, they got the stupid 70 millimeter. They got all that that he cares about. He just wants to show his goddamn movie there. You're sitting on top of the world. You got Star Wars. What do you need this? Do me a favor, Bobby, for me. And you know we've had many private conversations. I fucking partied with this guy over at Jimmy Kimmel's. Be a gracious man. I want Quentin to show this new movie. He's worked his ass off. He wants the equipment. Hateful Eight. Would you do it for me? All right? Christmas. It's Christmas, Christ's sake.
In the full version of this interview, Quentin was so touched by Stern's help that he teared up.
You're moved to tears over this.
No, that's very touching, man. I really appreciate it.
But the story didn't have a Disney happy ending. Bob Iger didn't budge, and the premiere at the Cinerama Dome was bumped to 2 weeks later. Tarantino was enraged. He promised he would never ever work with the company ever again, which had made quite a lot of money from Pulp Fiction and Kill Bill since Disney owned Miramax. They me over, and I made them a lot of money for Pulp Fiction. And that really is a bad way to treat a former employee who has worked very well for them. Yes, many may think it's not a big deal, but for a person who treasures details and devoted his whole life to film, it was a big deal, which is why the conflict got so much attention. Unfortunately, that was not the last hit Quentin received. The close circle which had leaked the script came full circle when a few days before the premiere the film was uploaded to the internet.
No one said the job was supposed to be easy.
No one said it's supposed to be that hard, neither.
So the movie going up against Star Wars, The Revenant, and Joy made a heroic effort when it collected $160 million worldwide. Nonetheless, it was considered a failure. 2 months later, at the Academy Awards, the picture was only nominated in 3 categories: Best Cinematography, Best Supporting Actress, and Best Soundtrack. After the promo tour for Hateful Eight ended, Quentin began developing an idea that had been at the front of his mind for the last 8 years. The movie would tell of Los Angeles in the 70s. I've been working on this script for 5 years, as well as living in Los Angeles County most of my life, including in 1969, when I was 6 years old. I'm very excited to tell this story of an LA and a Hollywood that doesn't exist anymore.
It really is a Los Angeles movie, and it deals with a couple of lead characters, but a lot of wild supporting characters that kind of make a blanket throughout the town.
After the Harvey Weinstein scandal, Quentin, who had worked with the brothers during his whole career, had to look for a new studio. He sent the screenplay to all the main players in Hollywood except for Disney. Later, it became a real bidding war that was eventually won by Sony. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood was released on the 26th of July, 2019. But more on that in the next video. The next plans of the director were shrouded in mystery. He was often mentioned in connection to the then unnamed project taking place in the Star Trek universe. Tarantino had mentioned his love for the original TV show several times, and said that he would gladly film his own interpretation. If before that had been speculation, now the project was announced. It will be co-produced by J.J. Abrams, filmed by Sony, and Mark L. Smith, who wrote The Revenant, will write the screenplay. Quentin's main condition was an R rating which wouldn't be lowered. Not under any circumstances. I guess that's about it. Quentin Tarantino is one of the most faithful fans of the cinema that shaped him, and has been wowing us with his brilliant style for the past 30 years. For him, it's not a job, it's a calling.
If you truly love cinema, with all your heart, and with enough passion, you can't help but make a good movie.
got room for one more?
Do you like our work? Let us know with your like and comment. Push that subscribe button and share with your friends. If you want to support the project financially, become our sponsor on Patreon or YouTube sponsorship. Thank you.